Hi everybody. It's good to see you. I hope you're well. Won't you pull you up a chair and set a spell while we sit and talk about the witch of Tilley Bend in Fanning, Georgia. Elizabeth Jane Tilley was born February 28, 1846 in North Carolina. Her parents were Tillman Tilley and her mother were Prudence Ford. Sometime before 1868, Elizabeth and her parents moved to Fanning, Georgia, where Elizabeth met Jason Bradley. Her falling in love with him, they married March 28, 1868. Well, there in Fanning, Georgia, around 1750, the Creek Indians lived in this part of the Appalachian Mountains. The settlers from the Carolinas moved alongside and began to marry into the tribes. Well, the Cherokee Indians, they didn't really like the Creek Indians, so they forced them out. But the settlers and their Creek spouses stayed behind. In the late 1800s, Elizabeth Tilley Bradley and her husband Jason were one of those families, with Elizabeth coming from the Carolinas and Jason being a local from Fanning, Georgia. They had 9 children, 2 boys and 7 girls, and they lived along the Toccoa River there in Tilley Bend. Elizabeth learned how to use plants and roots and other things to heal the sick from her ancestors. When the Creek Indians left, there were no doctors or medicine men around, so all the folks around turned to her for help. She became the local medicine woman. The Tilley family and the Stanleys were the most prominent family there in Fanning, Georgia, with the Stanley family living at Stanley Gap and the Tilley family living at Tilley Bend. The two families could never get along, so they started feuding and going back and forth, stealing and robbing and shooting each other. Well, October 26th, 1905, the Tilley and Stanley feud would come to a head. Elizabeth's daughter married one of the Stanley boys and was pregnant with his child at the time. One Sunday, the feud came to the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church. October 26th, 1905, Elizabeth and her family were attending the Sunday morning service. The Stanley family rode to the church and opened fire onto the church, killing Elizabeth's oldest daughter, the preacher, and one of Elizabeth's son-in-law. Elizabeth's daughter was pregnant with his child at the time, and the sight of his death disturbed her so bad, it set her into early labor, subsequently killing her and the young child. Well, to get revenge for what the Stanleys did, several of the Tilley men rode to Stanley Gap late at night to get revenge for the killings. Multiple Stanleys were killed that night, but Elizabeth, being the medicine woman that she was, and knowing old Creek ways, she'd had enough of this feud. What would she do to end it? Well, she used her old Creek ways and conjured up a curse for both the Tilley and the Stanley families. She vowed that neither family would ever have a child born or live for very long. Over the next year, not a single child lived for more than a month or so. They all died mysteriously. The churchyard became filled with the bodies of so many children, some even marked with field stones or even with no markers at all. Rumors began that Elizabeth was actually an old granny witch, and eventually both families had had enough, and they went to her demanding that the curse be lifted. Well, when she refused, she was taken to Mount Pleasant Church and hanged for her acts. They took her to the largest oak tree in the middle of the cemetery and strung her up. But before she fell, she told the curse would never be lifted and that she would return. She was hanged and buried right where she fell. To further defile her, she was buried facing west from the eastern sky. Over the next year, the babies still would die. So what could be the issue? Who could be responsible for this? Well, they began to blame Elizabeth's sister-in-law. She was accused for allowing Elizabeth to take possession of her body to keep the curse alive. So subsequently, she was taken and hanged just as Elizabeth was a year prior. But since Elizabeth was responsible and was in possession of her body, she was faced east in her burial ground. From that day forward, the curse was lifted. Well, sort of. The families had children, but it was still hard to keep them alive. Many still died, but a few would make it into adulthood. Well, folks, I want to thank you for joining me today as I told you the story of the witch of Tilley Bend. Boy, this was crazy. A Simple Creek woman, tired of having the feud going on around her, and it ended up costing her the life of a son-in-law, 2 daughters, and a grandchild. And to end it, all she did was create an old Indian curse. Folks, I want to thank you for listening. Love you to pieces, and we'll see you next time.